This hour with an environmental story. The grip of drought that is intensifying in the West has led scientists to turn to an unusual ally in the fight to limit the effects of climate change.
In 2009, a team of scientists drove 76 fake dams into a dying river in the eastern Oregon high desert. They were built from nothing but wooden posts and willow sticks, and almost no one believed they would survive a single spring. Then the beavers found them. What those animals did with 76 crude human-made frames over the next 4 years broke every prediction the team had made, rewrote what restoration was supposed to cost, and left the scientists standing in the channel staring at survey numbers none of them could explain.
Well, what we're hoping for is a place with deep water. Our hope is that they start building dams.
And these beavers are recharging it for us, so they're sort of depositing water into the bank that we take out at a later date.
This is what happened after the beavers found them. The dying river. So, let me show you the creek he is standing in, because you have to understand how far gone it was. By 2009, Bridge Creek, a tributary of the John Day, was barely functioning as a river at all. Over the previous century, the stream had carved itself into a deep, narrow trench. A vertical walled ditch cut several meters below the surrounding land. Picture a river that has sunk into a slot in the earth, running far beneath the valley it was supposed to feed, completely cut off from it. And the damage radiated outward from there. The water table had dropped so far below the surface that the willows and cottonwoods along the banks were dying of thirst. Standing on dry terraces high above a river they could no longer reach, their roots straining down toward water that had retreated meters beneath them. In summer, what little water remained routinely climbed to 25 degrees Celsius, right at the lethal limit for the threatened steelhead that were supposed to be spawning there.
This is unreal. Like, does this happen everywhere?
Where are we right now?
We are just downstream of the main beaver dam, which is holding back an absolutely enormous volume of water.
Here is the part that makes Bridge Creek different from almost every restoration story you have ever heard, though. The one animal capable of fixing this river, the North American beaver, was already there. A handful of colonies had been clinging on in this watershed for decades, building dams every single year, trying to slow the water and raise the level back up. And every single spring, the floods came roaring down the trench and destroyed everything they built. So the question here was never how to bring the beavers back. They had never really left. The question was stranger than that. And it is the one Weber and his team were actually asking. How do you help an engineer that is already on site, trapped inside a system that is physically beating it to pieces year after year, dam after dam? To answer that, they first had to understand why the beavers kept losing. And that answer has nothing to do with the beavers. A locked loop. Because the reason is not biology, it is physics, and it is brutal. Bridge Creek drains around 710 square kilometers of high desert. But historically, it was not a single channel at all. It was a braided multi-channel wetland, shallow water spread across a wide valley floor, held in place by generations of beaver dams that trapped sediment, stored groundwater, and released it slowly through the long, dry summers. The whole valley behaved like a sponge that maintained itself, season after season, with nobody supervising it. That system collapsed over about 100 years, and it went in a sequence. First, fur trappers stripped out the beaver population back in the 1800s. Then cattle grazing destroyed the woody vegetation along the banks. Now, there were no dams to slow the current and no roots to hold the soil, so the river started doing the only thing it could. It started cutting downward into its own bed. And here is where it gets vicious, because once it started, the loop locked itself in. Water trapped in a narrow, steep-walled trench moves faster. Faster water hits the bed harder. The harder it hits, the deeper it cuts. The deeper it cuts, the narrower the trench gets. And the narrower the trench, the faster the next flood tears through it. Every flood made the channel a little better at destroying itself. It was a machine for self-destruction, and it never switched off. By 2005, when baseline monitoring of the creek finally began, the trench was so deep that the spring snowmelt was being funneled through a corridor barely wide enough to hold it.
And they slow this water down. A lot of it does go into recharging the groundwater, and that's what we're pumping for irrigation. That's what we use for our food. That's what we use for our lawns.
All of that destructive power was aimed straight down at the bed, with nowhere to spread out. Nothing could accumulate down there. No sediment, no gravel, no structure of any kind. The river had become a chute, and the beavers were trapped inside that chute, trying to build. The trapped engineers. Somewhere between 1 and 4 colonies had hung on in this watershed since the 1990s. Small, stressed, barely making it. And listen, they were not lazy, and they were not bad at their jobs. They were working hard. They built an average of 40 dams a year, every year, trying to claw the river back. But here is the cruel mechanism underneath all that effort. Because the surrounding land had been stripped of its mature trees, the beavers had almost nothing left to build with. They were weaving thin willow shoots, the only material they could find, across the mouth of a canyon that funneled the full force of the spring flood straight at them. And I want you to really picture what a beaver is for a second. This is a rodent that can weigh up to 30 kilograms, with iron-reinforced incisors that can drop a 10-centimeter tree in under half an hour. This is an animal that evolved to fell timber and reshape entire valleys. Its whole body is a construction tool. And here it was, the most capable natural engineer in North America, reduced to threading willow scraps across a torrent, hoping something would hold. Nothing did. 89% of those dams failed within 5 years. Most did not survive a single spring, and you have to be precise about why, because it matters. The beavers were doing exactly what beavers do, with total competence on exactly the right problem. The failure was not theirs. The physics of the river had been bent so far that the output of a 30-kilogram animal simply did not register anymore. The floods tore their dams apart before a single grain of sediment could pile up behind them. So, that is the trap. An engineer working at full capacity, with the right instincts, on the correct problem, losing every year, not from any mistake, but because the whole system was rigged against it. And no beaver was ever going to think its way out, because the problem was never in the beaver, it was in the river. If that idea grabs you, the idea of a landscape that locks itself into a failure loop, and the small, almost embarrassingly simple interventions that can crack it open, then you are exactly who this channel is built for. Subscribe and stay with me, because the fix these scientists landed on sounds far too cheap to possibly work. And what the beavers did with it afterward is the part that genuinely nobody saw coming. The mechanical insight. The breakthrough was mechanical, not biological. And that one distinction is the whole story in miniature. The team, Nick Bowes and Nick Weber, working alongside Michael Pollock of NOAA and Joseph Wheaton of Utah State, looked at the trap and saw what most restoration projects miss entirely. They did not need to introduce an animal. The animal was already there, already working, already desperate to build.
Why do beavers need human help to build a dam?
Well, a lot of times, if it's too shallow, they're just kind of like walking hot dogs for predators. They need deep water to swim. They're very graceful in deeper water.
What they needed to do was change the physics of the river by the smallest possible amount, just enough to let that animal finally pull off the thing it had been failing at for decades. So in September of 2009, they installed 76 structures across 4 treatment reaches, spanning 3.5 kilometers of the creek. And the crucial thing is that these were never meant to be permanent. They were not rigid dams. They were starter skeletons, semi-porous frames built to do exactly one job: survive a single spring flood. Just one. Long enough to hand the beavers a foundation they could actually build on. Think about what that means as an experiment. What had launched as a steelhead recovery project was, underneath, a test of one razor-thin question. Could you restart an entire river system just by giving a few trapped animals a foundation that lasted 1 season longer than anything they could build for themselves? Starter skeletons. And the design is everything here, so stay with me, because this is why it worked when concrete never had. Traditional restoration leans on rigid barriers, concrete weirs, anchored log jams, imported boulders, things built to stop the water cold. And there is a fatal flaw in that no engineer ever fully escapes. When a flood slams into a rigid wall, the energy does not vanish. It cannot. It concentrates at the base and the edges, scouring and undercutting until the structure fails. You are picking a fight with a river, and the river always has more time than you do. The fake dams did the opposite. The woven willow lattice was semi-porous, so water leaked slowly through it at low flows and safely spilled over the top during floods. The posts driven into the bed were only about 8 centimeters thick, spaced roughly 1/3 of a meter apart, but driven deep enough to grip the weave and hold through the exact seasonal window when natural beaver dams had always been getting ripped apart.
Get on my belly and push it in, but I don't want to get that wet.
It's amazing all the steps that we have to do to help out something that should be a natural process.
The structure did not try to stop the river. It absorbed the blow and let the water pass straight through and over it, porous instead of solid, flexible instead of rigid, leaning with the punch instead of bracing against it. That single choice is the hinge the entire next decade swings on. Now, the only thing left to find out was whether the beavers would even show up. The first signs. They showed up almost immediately. Within months of installation, the creek started behaving like a different river. The starter dams slowed the water and forced it to pool, and the suspended sediment that had been racing uselessly through the trench for decades finally began dropping out and settling behind the structures. The river started rebuilding its own bed for the first time in a generation, and the beavers noticed fast. Roughly 1/4 of the structures were occupied within that first season. The animals found the pooling water, read exactly what it meant, and started weaving their own material into the human-built frames. Nobody taught them anything. To a beaver, a structure that is already holding back water is not a curiosity to investigate. It is an invitation. It is the start of a home. But none of it meant a thing yet, because the test that had killed every beaver dam on this creek for decades was still coming. And it was coming in the spring. The first flood. It arrived with the spring flood of 2010, the exact event that had been ripping natural beaver dams apart every year for as long as anyone had watched this creek. The starter dams held. The water passed through the lattice and over the crest instead of slamming into a solid wall and tearing it down. Most of the structures came through completely intact. The few that breached at the edges, and the beavers patched them within days. And because the structures survived, the flood was finally forced to do something it had never been allowed to do here. It dropped its sediment load behind the dams. The bed rose. Groundwater wells recorded the water table, climbing 1 to 3 feet vertically across the treatment reaches. And I need you to sit with what that means on the ground. For the first time in decades, water was reaching the root zones of the plants that had been dying on the terraces above. The willows drank. They threw out fresh shoots, and those shoots became the first decent building material the beavers had gotten their teeth into in a generation. Watch the loop reverse. Better dams raised the water. Higher water grew better willow. Better willow gave the beavers better material to build even better dams.
Beavers are largely nocturnal animals, meaning they're most active at night. It's very rare to see them so close.
You ready to go?
Yeah.
I'm ready to get out of here.
Okay, let's do it.
The spiral that had locked this river into a century of collapse was now running backward. And here is the thing that changes everything. It was powering itself. Nobody was turning a crank anymore. By the end of 2010, animals that had spent years building dams that washed away every spring suddenly had foundations that outlasted the worst the river could throw at them. And the question stopped being whether sticks and posts could survive a flood. It became something much bigger. Could an animal that weighs less than a Labrador reverse a full century of erosion that no amount of concrete had ever managed to touch? The engine starts. The team kept installing structures between 2010 and 2012, stacking new ones on top of the ones already buried by accumulated sediment, deliberately pushing the water higher and higher. By 2012, there were 121 functioning fake dams across the watershed. And then came 2013, and the number that quietly changed the field. That summer, the crews set out to walk the entire length of Bridge Creek and count every dam on it, every human-built structure, and every natural one. And somewhere along that survey line, Bowes and Weber start finding dams they never built. One in an upstream tributary where no post had ever been driven. Another in a side channel they had never touched. They keep walking, keep counting, and the tally keeps climbing past anything the original 76 structures could possibly account for. The final number was 236. Sit with that, because the team had built 76. The creek had more, then tripled their work entirely on its own. Standing in the channel with a tally sheet full of dams nobody on the project had ever placed, the realization arrived slowly, and then all at once. Bose and Weber were not the ones building this river anymore. They had become spectators to it. 121 of those were the human-built structures. The other 115 were completely independent beaver dams, built by an expanding population with zero human help, in places the team had never set foot to work. The beavers had blown straight past the treatment reaches. They were building in upstream tributaries, in side channels, in stretches of creek where not one post had ever gone into the ground. And those new dams were surviving because the upstream complexes had already absorbed enough of the flood's energy to shield everything downstream. Each dam made the next one more likely to last. 236 dams, up from an average of 40 that rarely lasted a year. The engine was fully autonomous now. It did not need the people who started it anymore. They could walk away, and it would keep building.
So without the beaver dam in this area, what would this be like right now?
This would be bone dry and sandy, which is what it was before the beavers moved in.
The total wetted surface area of the stream jumped by as much as 203% as water finally spilled up out of the trench and spread back across its historic floodplain. Satellite analysis showed a 20% increase in green growth along the treated banks, willows, sedges, and rushes colonizing ground that had been bare, cracked dirt for decades. From a satellite, the scar of the old trench was visibly closing, a green seam stitching itself back across the desert. But the single strangest result of the whole project was something nobody ordered, nobody designed, and nobody had even thought to look for. And when the temperature data finally came back, it pointed the exact wrong way. The cooling system. Everyone on the project had braced for the same problem, and it never showed up. And the reason it never showed up quietly changed what this whole thing even was. Every standard model predicted warming. Pool up water behind hundreds of dams, spread it wide and shallow under the relentless high desert sun, and it should heat up. Slower water, more surface area, more exposure. For a fish sitting right at its lethal temperature limit, that would have been a catastrophe. The cure would have been worse than the disease. The monitoring data, published in 2017, showed the exact opposite. Daily maximum summer temperatures in the beaver-dammed reaches dropped by as much as 2.5 degrees Celsius. And inside the dam complexes, sensors recorded variation of more than 8 degrees across tiny distances. Pockets of genuinely cold water sitting meters from warmer pools. A whole patchwork of temperature zones the fish could move between at will. On a hot August afternoon, a steelhead could slide a few meters sideways and find water several degrees cooler. The dams had not just cooled the creek, they had handed the fish a thermostat. Here is what was happening underground, and it is one of the most elegant things in nature. The sheer weight of all that pooled water, stacked behind hundreds of dams, was pressing down, forcing warm surface water down through the porous gravel of the stream bed into the saturated layer beneath. Down there, shielded from the sun and pressed against the cool mass of the earth, the water gave up its heat and cooled. Then it seeped back up hundreds of meters downstream as cold springs. The beavers had built, with zero awareness of what they were doing, an underground cooling system, pressurizing warm water into the ground and pulling cold water back out. A radiator made of sticks and gravel and the weight of the river itself.
Beavers, that what they do is they get in here and they just scoop the mud up. They just come and like grab a whole bunch, push it with their chest and hands, and
think about how absurd that is for a second. A handful of rodents with no blueprint and no intention had plumbed a working cooling circuit into the floor of a desert valley. And this is the moment the project quietly became something far bigger than its mission. What started as habitat restoration was now functioning as climate adaptation infrastructure, buffering the river against exactly the kind of warming that is projected to intensify across the interior West for decades. Nobody designed that, but cooler water is only worth anything if the fish can still reach it. And with more than 200 dams now standing in the channel, that had quietly become a very open question. The fish return, because the obvious. Objection writes itself. Fill a river with hundreds of dams and surely you wall the fish out. Steelhead have to migrate upstream to spawn. 200 dams sounds less like a restored river and more like 200 locked doors. The data says no. Flatly, no. Before the fake dams went in, 92% of tagged spawners successfully navigated the stream. After more than 200 dams went up, that number was just over 93%. It went up. Barely, but up, against every intuition. The dams did not block the fish because the structures had carved out side channels, spillways, and deep plunge pools below each crest. The adult fish used those pools as rest stops, recovering before pushing over the top or finding a way through. And the passage rate improved for a reason that captures the entire logic of the project in one line. The beavers had given the fish more routes, not fewer. And once the fish reached the spawning grounds, they arrived at a river that looked nothing like the scoured trench of a decade earlier. Cold water, deep pools, slow margins, food. The population data, published in 2016 after 8 straight years of monitoring, lands the whole story in hard numbers. Against untreated control reaches, the beaver-engineered sections showed a 52% increase in juvenile survival, a 168% increase in fish density and abundance, and a 175% increase in total biomass, meaning the young fish were not just more numerous, they were growing bigger and faster in the rich, food-packed habitat the beavers had built around them. Let that land. Bigger fish, more of them. Surviving at better than double the rate, in a stretch of creek that 10 years earlier could not hold a single dam in place for one spring. That is the single largest documented improvement in threatened steelhead productivity from any habitat restoration project anywhere in the entire Columbia River Basin. Not from concrete, not from machinery, from sticks, water pressure, and an animal that was already there. And every bit of it was built by a workforce that never once sent an invoice, which leaves only one question worth asking, and the answer is almost insulting. What did all of this actually cost? A river that runs itself. Those original 76 starter dams are rotting away now. That was always the plan. The beavers replaced them years ago, and they keep building new dams, new canals, new ground flooded every single year, without $1 of ongoing construction cost. The maintenance crew is the wildlife, and the wildlife does not bill by the hour. So here is the number. The total price of the entire human intervention on Bridge Creek was $374,000. Traditional engineered restoration of that same stretch would have run somewhere between $3.4 million and $34 million. And here is the part that really lands. That expensive version would have started degrading the second the last machine drove off. You would be paying to maintain it forever, fighting the river every step of the way. Instead, the river maintains itself. It got an engineer that works for free, never clocks out, never quits, and upgrades its own infrastructure a little more every year. You do not maintain it, it maintains you. And that is the quiet bomb buried in this whole story. Every restoration budget you have ever heard of assumes the fix is something you buy and then defend forever. Bridge Creek assumes the exact opposite. The method has since been adopted right across the American West, in Colorado, Utah, Idaho, Nevada, and California. And federal agencies have even fast-tracked permitting to scale it up. And the principle it proved is not complicated, though it took a decade of undeniable data to make it impossible to argue with. Sometimes the most effective engineering is not what you build. It is giving the right builder a foothold that lasts one extra season. Because Bridge Creek was never really out to prove that beavers are useful. We have known that for centuries. What it proved is sharper, and a little unsettling. A system locked in a destructive loop, one that has shrugged off every expensive fix thrown at it, can be cracked open with an intervention so cheap it barely counts as construction as long as the engine on the other side of the lock is sitting there, ready to take over the instant you turn the key. 76 structures, 0 beavers introduced, $374,000, and a river that now runs itself, indefinitely, for free. So here's the question I keep turning over, and I want to hear your answer in the comments. If a 30-kilogram rodent can out-engineer $30 million of concrete, how many other broken systems are just sitting there, waiting for us to stop building and start handing the problem to the engineer that is already on site? Tell me what you would put a beaver in charge of. And if this is the kind of engineering that pulls you in, landscapes that break, and the strange, cheap, brilliant mechanisms that fix them, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.